Hey everyone, welcome to the show.
Yeah.
Have you ever imagined like a whole town built by people who had escaped slavery?
Wow, that's
A beacon of
yeah.
self-reliance,
Yeah,
against incredible odds.
that's incredible.
That's just one of the stories that we're going to be kind of digging into today as we deep dive into how we heal. It's a memoir by LaJune Montgomery Tabron. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes.
Okay.
Oh, and you can find a link to the book on Amazon in the description below.
Perfect.
This book, it's not just a personal story, though.
Right.
It's like a call to action,
Oh, yeah?
a blueprint for how racial healing can, like, completely change
Yeah.
communities and even whole nations.
I think what really impressed me about this book was that, Tabron doesn't just tell her story. She finds these really deep lessons from her experiences.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be looking at her journey starting with her childhood in Detroit during the Civil Rights era,
Wow.
all the way to her leadership at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation.
Oh, wow.
But we're always going to be thinking about these bigger ideas of equity and healing.
Let's start with her childhood then in Detroit during the 60s and 70s.
Okay.
It sounds like the city was like this perfect example of America's struggle with race at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. Tabron describes a city that's wrestling with integration and segregation.
Right.
Racial tensions were really high.
Wow.
She even saw the 1967 Detroit Rebellion, firsthand,
Yeah.
a time of serious civil unrest.
Yeah.
For a lot of white families, this unrest actually started what we call white flight, which is a huge movement of people to the suburbs.
Yeah.
And because of this, Tabron actually lost her best friend who lived next door,
Oh, wow.
which shows how these big changes in society
Yeah.
had real effects on people's lives.
Yeah. So interesting how
Yep.
just a few miles away, life was completely different in the suburbs.
Exactly. And Tabron points out this big difference between her integrated neighborhood
Yeah.
and the mostly white suburbs, showing these huge differences in housing,
Right.
education, and opportunity that we still see in so many cities in the U.S.
Okay, so now about that town built by freed slaves.
Well, yeah.
This is the part that really caught my attention.
Yeah, yeah.
Tabron's ancestor, Isaiah Thornton Montgomery, he founded this town called Mound Bayou in Mississippi.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It is.
What's amazing about Mound Bayou is that it wasn't just a place where people lived.
Right.
It was this thriving, self-governing community.
Yeah.
They set up schools,
Right.
businesses,
Wow.
even their own local government. And it
Mhm.
really challenges the story that people used to tell about Black communities back then.
Yeah, for sure. But unfortunately, as we find out in the book, Mound Bayou eventually declined.
And this is where it gets really interesting
Yeah.
and sad.
Yeah.
Because Mound Bayou's decline wasn't just bad luck. It was directly because of a lack of investment and care. A pattern we see over and over again in Black communities throughout history. The broken promises of Reconstruction after the Civil War really led to this unfair disadvantage.
And Tabron actually visited Mound Bayou in 2012, didn't she?
Yes, she did.
Wow.
And her thoughts on how it looks now add another layer to the story.
Right.
She found a town struggling with old infrastructure.
Hmm.
Not many opportunities.
Right.
A stark reminder that historical injustices still have a huge impact,
Yeah.
shaping the realities of communities today.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like education played a huge role in Tabron's journey.
For sure.
She went to Cass Tech High School, a very diverse public school in Detroit, and then on to the University of Michigan.
Wow.
It must have been a very different environment for her.
That's a great point. Tabron says that her time at the University of Michigan was a big shock. Suddenly, she was one of the only Black women in her program.
That must have been tough.
It was. And she faced these subtle, sometimes obvious biases from professors and counselors. Some even questioned whether a Black woman could succeed there.
Wow.
It makes you realize how important mentors and allies are, especially when you're in places where you're not well represented. Tabron's mentor was Dr. Alfred L. Edwards, an economics professor. He saw her potential and pushed her to keep going.
It's so important to have someone who believes in you like that.
Yeah.
Especially when there are so many challenges around you.
Absolutely.
But even with a good education and a prestigious job at a big accounting firm, she still hit a wall.
Right. And this shows how sneaky systemic bias can be. Despite being qualified, Tabron was sidelined because of her race. It reminds us that even in places that seem progressive, deep-seated biases can limit opportunities for minorities.
That's crazy.
It is, and this experience led her to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. She hoped it would be a place where she could make a real difference.
That brings us to her time at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. where she spent 3 decades working her way up to CEO.
Wow, 3 decades.
I'm guessing it wasn't always easy.
No, it wasn't. Tabron was a strong advocate for racial equity,
Yeah.
pushing the foundation to go beyond just surface-level actions and actually tackle the root causes of inequality.
I bet that made some people uncomfortable.
It did. She often faced resistance from colleagues and board members who weren't ready for such a bold approach.
But it sounds like she made some real progress.
Absolutely. Under her leadership, the foundation changed a lot.
Oh.
They officially committed to being an anti-racist organization,
Mm.
not just in giving grants, but in their own culture and practices.
That must have been a huge shift.
It was.
For sure.
Tabron led lots of programs and initiatives aimed at addressing racial disparities
Oh, wow.
across different areas like education, healthcare, and community development. She really pushed the foundation to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And this is where the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Framework, or TRHT, becomes really important.
It does.
Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. TRHT, which Tabron and the Kellogg Foundation champion,
Right,
is a complex approach to racial healing.
right.
It stresses truth-telling,
Great.
recognizing shared values, and taking real action
Yeah.
to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality. It recognizes that racial healing isn't just about how individuals feel. It's about addressing the systemic and structural factors that keep those inequalities in place.
Right, so it's not just about feeling guilty of the past, but understanding how it affects the present
Yeah,
and taking steps to create a more just future.
exactly.
Awesome. Well, this is fascinating, but we're going to have to pause here for now.
Oh, okay.
So be sure to tune in to part 2, where we continue our deep dive into how we heal.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it. So we were talking about the economic argument for racial healing. Tabron brings up some interesting research in the book.
Okay, so what's the connection between, racial healing and economics?
Well, she mentions a study by the Alterum Institute
Okay.
that found that closing the racial earnings gap in the U.S. could boost the GDP by trillions of dollars.
Wow.
By 2050, it could increase by $8 trillion,
Wow.
which is actually more
That's a lot.
than the entire federal budget in 2023.
That is a huge number.
Yeah.
It really shows how racial inequity isn't just a social issue. It's an economic one that affects everyone. But Tabron doesn't just use statistics. She uses her own experiences to show how widespread racism is.
Exactly.
Wow.
One story that stuck with me was about her being followed home by a police officer for no apparent reason.
Oh, wow. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So Tabron and her husband were just driving home
Right.
when a police car started following them.
Wow.
And it followed them all the way to their driveway.
Oh, gosh.
This is something a lot of people of color can relate to, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's often called driving while black.
Yeah, that's scary.
It's a reminder that even normal, everyday things can become really scary for people of color
Yeah,
because of suspicion and fear.
for sure.
What's even more frustrating is that when Tabron talked about this with the police chief later, he suggested she should have just pulled the officer over and asked him to stop following her.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
That seems so out of touch.
It does, right.
Yeah.
Tabron points out that for a black person,
Right.
especially a black man, pulling over a police officer could have made things worse and put them in danger.
Wow, yeah.
It highlights the disconnect between what people of color experience
Right.
and the perspectives of those in power.
Yeah, it's a really important reminder that racial healing needs empathy and understanding.
Absolutely.
And recognizing that people face different realities because of their race and background. This goes back to that Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Framework, right?
It does. TRHT helps create conversations,
Right.
build relationships, and dismantle systems that perpetuate racial inequity.
It sounds like Tabron has been part of these healing circles you mentioned before.
She has. She talks about being in racial healing circles, and she describes them as safe spaces where people can share their experiences, listen to others, and work towards understanding and reconciliation. It's not about placing blame,
Right.
but about having honest conversations about race.
So how do these circles actually work? Can you give us an example?
Sure. Tabron shares a really moving story about co-facilitating healing circles with descendants of enslaved people and members of the Jesuit order,
Wow.
which historically profited from slavery.
Wow.
It was a really complex and delicate situation,
Yeah.
but they used the principles of TRHT
Right.
to create a space for dialogue and understanding.
That's incredible.
It was one tangible outcome was a $100 million foundation
Wow.
dedicated to addressing the legacy of slavery.
Wow.
It shows that racial healing can lead to real action and positive change,
Yeah.
even in situations with a lot of pain and trauma.
That's amazing to see how these conversations can make a real difference. It seems like honesty and telling the truth are super important in this process.
They are.
Yeah.
Tabron talks about being at a TRHT training where a young activist challenged her and other leaders by saying, "You guys failed us."
Wow. What happened after that?
The activist pointed out that even with their efforts, racial inequalities were still there and getting worse in some cases.
Wow.
This encounter motivated Tebron and her colleagues to support a new generation of activists and leaders who are working to dismantle systemic racism.
That's a good reminder that racial healing is a process that involves multiple generations.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to listen to and learn from those who are leading the way for change.
It seems like the media also shapes how we understand race and racism.
It does. Tabron criticizes how the media often focuses on the most shocking parts of protests, portraying black protesters as violent and destructive, while downplaying the peaceful actions of white protesters. This biased reporting makes people of color seem less human
Right.
and reinforces harmful stereotypes.
It's subtle, but really dangerous.
It is.
And it can have a huge impact on how the public sees things. And it's not just the media. It seems like this lack of empathy is everywhere.
Yeah, she talks about this empathy deficit,
Right.
where people are less likely to empathize with those from different racial backgrounds. She shares some shocking statistics about racial disparities in healthcare,
Oh, wow.
noting that black patients are less likely to get pain medication
Wow.
and often face dismissive attitudes from medical professionals.
That's heartbreaking that people are denied proper medical care because of their race.
Yeah.
Where does this mistrust come from?
These disparities come from a long history of medical racism,
Right.
including terrible experiments like the Tuskegee syphilis study. These events naturally led to a deep mistrust of the medical system among many Black Americans. This mistrust,
Okay.
along with barriers to healthcare access, contribute to the health disparities
Yeah.
and higher rates of chronic diseases we see among people of color. It's clear that these issues are complicated and connected.
They are.
It's good that Tabor doesn't shy away from this complexity.
It is. She even acknowledges the limitations of the women's movement, pointing out that it often prioritized the rights of white women over black women.
Right.
It's important to remember that even movements for social justice can have flaws and perpetuate systems of oppression.
That's a great reminder that we always need to check our own biases. So can you tell us more about those community-level examples of racial healing that you mentioned?
Absolutely. Taboron shares inspiring stories of communities across the country that are using TRHT principles to fight racial injustice. For example, in Flint, Michigan, which was really affected by the water crisis, residents formed a task force to deal with racial disparities and access to COVID-19 testing, treatment, and economic help. This initiative, based on racial healing principles, aimed to dismantle that idea of a hierarchy of human value. That often makes marginalized communities suffer the most during crises.
All right, it sounds like they were trying to fix those systemic problems that made the water crisis so bad for communities of color. Are there other examples of TRHT in action?
Yes. Another powerful example is Kalamazoo, Michigan, where activists got a fair housing ordinance passed. This ordinance came from TRHT efforts.
Wow.
And aimed to address the city's history of housing discrimination by stopping landlords from discriminating against tenants based on race, ethnicity, or income.
That's great to see how these initiatives are tackling so many problems, from healthcare to housing. It shows how flexible the TRHT framework is.
What's really inspiring is that these initiatives aren't solutions forced on people from the outside. They come from local communities working together to create a fairer future for everyone.
It seems that community-driven approach is at the heart of Tabron's ideas. It's not about telling people what to do.
No.
It's about giving them the power to shape their own futures.
You got it. She strongly believes that real change has to come from within communities. She's a big supporter of place-based philanthropy, focusing on investing in organizations and initiatives led by the communities they serve.
Can you give us an example of what that looks like in action?
Sure. One example is Valley Settlement in Colorado, which provides bilingual preschool education and family engagement opportunities to the Latinx community in the Roaring Fork Valley.
That's an important initiative.
It is.
Especially with the growing diversity in our country. What's so special about this program?
This program understands the importance of meeting families where they are, both physically and in terms of their needs. They offer mobile preschool services and empower parents to be involved in their children's education. It's a way of addressing not just educational needs,
Yeah.
but also the social and economic factors that
Right.
can affect a child's development.
It's about removing those barriers and creating opportunities for every child to succeed. Are there other programs that use this place-based approach?
Yes, another great example is the Foundation's partnership with Navajo Power, which is a mostly native-owned public benefit corporation developing clean energy projects on tribal lands.
That's really interesting. How does this relate to racial healing?
This is especially important because it addresses the history of environmental and economic exploitation that indigenous communities have faced. It gives them the power to lead the change towards a more sustainable future,
Yeah.
showing how racial healing can go hand in hand with environmental justice.
That's a great point.
Recognizing these issues are all connected.
It seems like collaboration is a big theme in the book.
Yes, Tabron's approach to philanthropy focuses on collaboration and partnership, recognizing that the Kellogg Foundation can't solve these complex problems alone.
Right.
She believes in working with communities,
Right.
listening to their needs,
Yeah.
and supporting their work to create lasting change.
It's moving away from the old top-down model of philanthropy and towards a more collaborative and community-driven approach. It recognizes the wisdom and skills within the communities themselves. It's not about imposing solutions. It's about listening,
Yes.
learning, and working together. But Tavern doesn't just focus on the U.S., right?
Right. While the book mainly looks at the U.S.,
Right.
Tabron also finds inspiration from examples of reconciliation and healing around the world.
I'd love to hear about those global perspectives. Can you give an example?
One of the best examples is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa,
Hmm.
set up after apartheid to address the horrors of the past
Right.
and promote healing.
You're talking about the commission led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
Exactly.
I remember learning about that. It was a groundbreaking effort.
It was. The commission focused on truth-telling,
Mhm.
forgiveness,
Right.
and restorative justice. It's a model for other countries dealing with legacies of conflict and oppression. Tabron also shares insights from Albie Sachs,
Okay.
a former judge on the South African Constitutional Court who helped write the country's post-apartheid constitution.
That's fascinating. What were some of his key insights?
Sachs says it's important to not erase the past, but to face it and use it
Yeah.
as a foundation for building a fairer future.
It's about recognizing the past,
Yes.
but not letting it define the future.
Exactly. His vision for Constitution Hill, a place that has both a human rights museum and the Constitutional Court,
Wow.
shows this principle. It's a space where the horrors of the past, like the apartheid-era prison where Nelson Mandela was held,
Wow.
exist alongside the hope for a better future. This way of remembering the past is a powerful reminder that healing doesn't mean forgetting.
Right.
It means learning from it and using it to guide our actions in the present.
It seems like Tabron's book is both a call to action and a source of inspiration. She's not just identifying the problem, she's offering concrete steps on how we can create a more just and equitable world.
She is. She challenges readers to look at their own biases and become active in the movement for racial healing. She gives practical steps individuals can take, like having honest conversations about race, supporting organizations working for racial justice, and advocating for policies that promote equity and inclusion.
It's about taking individual action, but also realizing that systemic change is needed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She tells a heartwarming story about a young girl in Detroit who chose her as her Black History Month hero. It shows the importance of representation
Wow.
and the impact that positive role models can have, especially for young people from marginalized communities.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story that shows how individual actions can inspire and empower others. Seeing someone who looks like you achieving success in a field where you're underrepresented can be really powerful.
It can.
Tabron's book is a powerful call to action.
It is.
But it also gives us hope. She believes that racial healing is possible, and she gives us examples of communities that are moving towards a more just and equitable future.
She does. One of the main messages of the book is that racial healing isn't just about fixing past mistakes.
Right.
It's about creating a better future for everyone.
Yeah, it's about building a society where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, regardless of their race or background.
Exactly. By dealing with the root causes of racial inequity, we can create a more vibrant and prosperous society for everyone.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into how we heal,
Okay.
I want to ask you, the listener, What steps can you take to contribute to racial healing in your community? What resonated with you the most from Tabron's story?
Think about that, because in part 3, we'll talk more about the practical implications of Tabron's message and how we can all work towards change.
Welcome back to our deep dive on how we heal. We've been talking about LeJune Montgomery Tabron's memoir and her ideas about racial healing. Now, I want to focus on what we can actually do. Like, what steps can we take to make a difference in our own communities?
Well, Tabron talks about a few things in her book. She
Yeah.
says it's important to have open and honest conversations about race, even when it's uncomfortable, you know?
Right.
It's about going beyond just saying, oh, I don't see color, and actually acknowledging the real history and systems of racism.
So it's more than just being nice to everyone. It's about really talking about these tough issues and challenging our own biases.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
She also says it's important to support organizations working to address racial disparities.
That makes sense. How can we support those organizations?
There are lots of ways, you know. You could think about donating to local groups that are fighting for fair housing,
Mm,
or volunteering at a community center in a marginalized community.
yeah.
Even just sharing the messages of activists and organizers on social media can help.
Right. So there are many ways to get involved depending on what you're interested in and what resources you have. But what about the bigger issues, the systemic ones? How do we tackle those?
Another important step is to advocate for policies that promote equality and inclusion.
Can you give us some examples of what that would look like?
Sure, that could mean reaching out to your elected officials to tell them you support things like police reform, affordable housing, or equal access to healthcare and education. It's about speaking up for change at a bigger level.
Right. Recognizing that these problems aren't just personal, they're political too. And we need to push our leaders to create a fairer society. Tabron seems to emphasize that racial healing is an ongoing thing, right?
Yes, it's a journey,
Yeah.
not a destination. It takes constant work and a dedication to dismantling the systems that cause inequality.
So it's not a quick fix. It's a lifelong commitment to creating a better world. And she shares that really touching story about a young girl in Detroit who chose her as her Black History Month hero.
Oh, yeah.
It shows how important it is for people to see themselves represented and the positive effect that role models can have, especially for young people from marginalized groups.
Absolutely. That story really shows how individual actions can inspire others.
Yeah, seeing someone who looks like you succeed in a field where you're underrepresented can be really powerful.
Absolutely. It can open up possibilities.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Tabron's book is a strong call to action, but it also gives us hope.
It does.
Right. She believes that racial healing is possible.
Yeah.
And she shows us examples of communities that are making things better.
She does.
It's about creating a society where everyone can thrive, no matter their race or background.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By addressing the root causes of racial inequity, we can create a better and more successful society for all.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into how we heal, think about what you can do today to help. Maybe it's starting a conversation, making a donation, advocating for a policy change,
Yeah.
or even just learning more about these issues.
Those are great ideas.
Any action, big or small,
Right.
can help make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this journey exploring how we heal. Please share your thoughts and what you liked about the book in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into important ideas.
Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working towards a better future for everyone.